In this video, you'll discover how to grow your podcast without social media. So look, if you're like most podcasters, you're probably creating endless content, posting constantly on social media, creating those promotional viral clips, writing super detailed show notes, hoping your audience will somehow find you. And yet, your show isn't growing as fast as you'd like or as fast as it should be. You see other people finding tons of success and you're left wondering, well, what am I doing differently? But what if I told you there's a much better way? A new way to leverage other people's audiences without spending countless hours creating more content, posting more on social media, targeting high-profile guests in hopes that high-profile guests will bring a new audience to your show, only for that high-profile guest to not promote the podcast, and even when they do, the audience doesn't come. The show still remains the same, and your growth basically stays plateaued. And what if I told you there's a way for you to grow your podcast and reach a new audience without relying on social media, without relying on word of mouth to try and grow your podcast? Well, today I'm going to pull back the curtain and show you 4 proven ways and strategies that are working right now that are helping entrepreneurs, experts, and online coaches to grow their shows way faster. So look, my name is Anthony Winery and I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListeners.com, a company helping entrepreneurs and experts grow podcasts that builds their personal brand and attracts dream clients to their business. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters and the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generated $120,000 in profit in the last 9 months for our business. But this is about me, this is about you. So let's dive straight in. Let me show you why the traditional podcast growth advice is fundamentally broken. Now, most podcasters are following what I call the create and hope strategy. It looks a little bit like this. You create content, you post it on social media, you write detailed show notes, you network in podcast groups and communities in hopes that somehow new listeners and potential clients will discover your podcast. But it's literally never worked. And the reason why this approach fails is simple. Number one, there's a discovery problem. First, you're trying to build an audience from scratch. But think about this. Every time you release a new episode, you're again starting from zero. You have to somehow get each piece of content in front of a new audience who haven't heard of you before. And more content doesn't equal more listeners. The likelihood is, if you're watching this right now, you might be stuck with slow and steady growth, or your podcast might have plateaued. And in some cases that we see far too often, people are 2, 3 years, 4 years into their podcast, all the time, effort, and energy spent on the show, for their podcast to start declining, for them to actually be losing listeners. Now again, more content doesn't equal more listeners, because there's hundreds of podcasts out there who've published hundreds of episodes who are still stuck with slow and steady growth. It's like shouting into an empty room, hoping that someone walks by. So secondly, you're fighting against the platforms that weren't designed for podcast growth. Social media is quite literally your enemy when it comes to turning strangers online into active listeners of your podcast. The algorithms are quite literally built to keep people on their platforms, not to send people to your podcast. So when you post about your podcast on Instagram, well, people stay on Instagram. When you post about your podcast on LinkedIn, oftentimes people stay on LinkedIn. When you post about your podcast on Twitter, people stay on Twitter. Now look, don't just take what I say and believe it as Bible, because why the hell would you do that? But really think about your own experience. When you're on social media, what are you doing? You're looking to be educated, to be distracted, to maybe watch some promotional clips to let time pass by. But you're often not going onto social media to discover a new podcast. And even when you do on the off chance find an incredible clips, I'm sure we've all seen incredible clips. What do? You might share it with a friend, with a family member, but you're sharing the clip. You're not then going on to listen to the podcast. You've gotten the value from the piece of content you've consumed, which is the clips. Again, you're there for the promotional clips, or rather you're there for the podcast clips and to get educated, to be entertained. But you're not then going along and listening to a 60-minute long episode. That doesn't work like that. So really understanding fundamentally how are listeners consuming content, how are listeners finding shows. And oftentimes what you find is that most people are not going onto social media to discover a new podcast to listen to. It just doesn't happen. So again, you're essentially trying to convince someone online to leave the platform they're enjoying to go somewhere else. It's an uphill battle. Problem number 3. Now here's the biggest problem of all. You're trapped in what I call the content hamster wheel, where essentially you create content for hours, you post endlessly on social media, constantly networking, and then more continuous promotion. It's a vicious cycle that most podcasts are stuck doing for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, some even 4 years, repeating the same process and actions that don't actually drive growth for their podcasts. Now, I know this because I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and we speak to hundreds of podcasts every single week, every single month. And it blows my mind the number of podcasts that we find who make the same mistake that I was making with my clients back in the day. Because I used to think that, hey, if you just post on social media, then the podcast will grow. If I just create more content, the podcast will grow. But then when you ask someone, hey, you've been posting content on social media for the last 2 to 3 years, and you've been podcasting for that amount of time, has that been actually working? Has that helped you grow your podcast significantly? And the answer is basically no, it hasn't, because my show's plateaued or my show's declining. So clearly that strategy doesn't work. And this content hamster wheel keeps people stuck. But here's what nobody's telling you, right? The fastest growing podcasts aren't doing any of this. Instead, they're leveraging one simple truth. It's way easier to borrow attention than to build it from scratch. If you're a podcaster, if you're a coach, an expert, you're trying to grow your podcast because you want to share a good message, you want to make an impact, but you also, hey, look, you want to make some money. You also want to get paid. You want to make sure you're not sinking all this time, effort, and energy without either reaching your full potential, meaning breaking past whatever plateau you might be facing, and also turning some of your audience and some of your listeners into paying clients so you can make more impact with them, and also get an ROI for the time and effort you've invested. Make the impact finally feel like a success. Now, for that to happen, you fundamentally have to grow your podcast. And the interesting thing about this is the fact that when you're in it and when you're kind of stuck in the nuts and bolts of running your podcast, running your business, having a family to take care of, you often kind of forget just to ask the very basic and fundamental questions, which are simple questions like, well, if I want more podcast listeners, where do podcast listeners hang out? Like, how do the top people in the industry grow their podcast audience? What strategies and methods are they using to reach listeners when those listeners are actively listening? Because clearly social media doesn't work. If not, you wouldn't be watching this right now to look at alternative ways to grow without social media. And yeah, I don't know, just asking these fundamental questions. And if we get to that point of, okay, well, how do podcasts actually grow? How do we reach more of the right listeners when they're actively listening? How do we make sure when I'm exposed to those to a new audience, they are receptive to becoming a listener of my own podcast? And that leads me to this point here. The biggest creators, entrepreneurs who are building audiences, building their personal brands and attracting dream clients to their business, like Alex Hormozi, Amy Porterfield, Gary V, I said it very funnily, Gary V, Tony Robbins, Andrew Tate, hate him, love him, doesn't really matter. All of these people and countless more that I can name, Simon Sinek, all of these huge names, Tim Ferriss, all of these creators and entrepreneurs, they're all growing their audience and all growing their brand and growing their podcasts by leveraging collaboration with other podcasts. And this is what you can see here. This is them collaborating with other shows. Alex Hormozi, they go on what we call pod tours, a season where they're guesting on a bunch of shows similar to their own, right? And what this allows them to do is allows them to, number one, they are doing this because they understand that being a guest on other people's podcasts allows you to get more clients and customers, shortcut your way into a massive audience, build huge authority and become a thought leader, be constantly exposed to a new audience base who've never heard of you before, network with influential and industry leaders, accelerate your brand's growth so you can make way more money and impact, and quickly generate high quality content for social media with little effort. They understand that strategic collaboration with other top shows is so powerful. Instead of building everything from the ground up, you're tapping into an audience that already exists. That's a major difference. When you collaborate with other podcasts, your audience is already there. They're already in podcast listening mode. They're actively listening to podcasts. They trust the host's recommendation, so when you're the one who is being interviewed, the spotlight is on you. The same way that when you're interviewing other people on your podcast, your audience is being introduced to them. And your audience trusts the guest because they're on your podcast. So we want to flip the script and have the spotlight being on you, and have you be the person who's extracting all of the value. Have you be the person who has all of the attention. Have you be the person who has the opportunity to actually shine, share your message, and attract a new audience into your own. And finally, when you're being a guest on someone else's show and you have a talking point or a topic, that audience, they're listening, they are looking for solutions for that specific problem or that topic. So when you're being the person of value, well, guess what? You're going to be far more likely to turn some of their audience into clients as well as listeners. Now, you do all this without you having to waste time trying to convince random people to listen to your show. That definitely should say listen, it says list, but we'll go with it. They are already engaged and ready to discover you. You're not trying to find, again, social media algorithm, because podcast listeners stay for long form content, meaning you have their undivided attention for 40 minutes rather than just 15 seconds. Imagine a 15-second clip versus someone listening to you for 40 minutes. You tell me which one of those are far more likely to convert someone into a loyal fan or loyal listener and potentially turn them into a high-ticket client. Which one's more likely? A 15-minute clip on social media of you just promoting, or you being a guest on someone else's show where the audience spends 30 minutes to an hour with you whilst you're being interviewed, sharing your insights and providing value to their audience? You don't have to spend hours on paid ads. You can leverage another host's audience, which gives you a warm, high-converting exposure for free. You don't have to hope that someone stumbles across your show and then becomes a fan of the podcast. You're placed directly in front of the perfect audience that are pre-filtered. These aren't just random shows. These are qualified, highly vetted shows that are interested in what you already have to say. And finally, you're not starting from scratch. You're borrowing instant credibility by being endorsed by a trusted host. Look, guys, I hope you're liking my sales pitch here, because I'm really trying to make sure you understand just how insanely valuable this is by you being a guest on other people's shows. So this is my sales argument, I guess, for you guys. I want to convince and show you, hey, look, you need to be considering this. And don't worry, in just a moment, I'm going to walk you through exactly the different methods of collaborating. But for now, I just want to create the right frame. So with that being said, I want to walk you through 4 ways to shortcut your way to a much bigger audience. Strategy number 1, strategic podcast guesting. So this is the traditional approach where essentially you are guesting on someone else's podcast. That's simply it. You are being a guest and featuring as a guest on someone else's show. You're being interviewed on their podcast and you're providing a ton of value, sharing your insights, your story to their audience. Now, the typical way is most podcasters do try and guest on other people's shows. But the issue is they essentially just like guest on random shows or shows that aren't highly targeted and super specific to the audience they want to reach. And that causes issues because you're essentially wasting time speaking to a podcast that either isn't actually that big, so the exposure isn't big enough, or they're not the right audience. They're not the right fit for what you have to deliver. And this will happen when you go on generic podcasts that just have like a bunch of different topics they talk about. For us, it's really about having a more targeted approach for this to really work. So here's why it works so well. Well, number 1, you're actually accessing pre-qualified listeners, meaning they're active listeners and they're interested in the topic you have to cover. If you're going to talk about reducing anxiety, you need to guest on podcasts about reducing anxiety or stress management or personal development, something that's closely related to your talking point. They're already in a podcast listening mode, like I mentioned, with this when you're being a guest, and you're instantly positioned as an authority by association. One appearance can lead to multiple different opportunities. That's something I can't stress enough. When you are introduced to a podcast audience that are way bigger, so many more opportunities open up. Because the show you're being a guest on and featuring on, well, they have a huge audience pool. And that could be either potential clients, potential listeners, potential people who are very interested in what you have to offer and want to collaborate further with you. The opportunity really is endless. Now, we've seen podcasters get more listeners from one strategic guest appearance than 3 months of posting on social media. It's such a clear difference. This is how Dawn went from 900 monthly downloads to 4,000 plus monthly downloads in 6 months. One of the main strategies that we use to help her grow her podcast is by her featuring as a guest on other people's shows. Her podcast, you can see right here, was all about Dear Divorce Diary. That's the name of her show. It was all about divorce, relationship, recovering after that. And she was guessing on highly targeted podcasts we helped her find, vet, and qualify to make sure she was adding the most amount of value to this new audience. And when we done that as a main strategy, well, her audience grew. She expanded her reach, and then she built her authority within her space. Other clients like Bria here, who actually grew her, who was able to consistently add 50 plus new followers per week on her Instagram. And she mentioned how by her guessing on other top shows in her industry, she was actually able to connect with six top 0.5 and 1% podcasts. These are globally massive shows. And her email list increased by 25% within 30 days. And again, I think she was just under 10,000 monthly downloads. When she joined, started working with us, she's around 4,000 monthly downloads. Again, really showing the impact that this drives genuine, real results. It's not just some like theory of like, oh yeah, try it. No. If you do this, it will absolutely work for you. Again, you have to just be strategic in terms of the steps you're taking. Strategy number 2, smart show sponsorship. Here's what it looks like. Now, this strategy might surprise you because I'm about to tell you essentially that you can buy your way into your dream audience for less than a daily coffee. Here's what I mean, and here's how this really works. Most people don't realize that you can sponsor other people's shows, meaning you can run advertising on someone else's podcast where they recommend your podcast to their audience. And all you have to do is pay them a specific fee. Now, traditional advertising would be around $20 to $30 per 1,000 views. Social media ads, you're looking at $15 to $25 per 1,000 impression. With podcast sponsorship, it's as low as $25 to $50 per 1,000 engaged listeners. So this is a fancy way of saying that if you want to promote your podcast on someone else's podcast, so if you have an anxiety podcast and you want to promote your podcast on, let's say, a massive personal development podcast, because them two will be closely related, you can pay a host, let's say $50. Honestly, those numbers are the industry average. What we've found to work super well for our clients is really pitching a bit higher. So actually we're pitching around $50 to $100 per 1,000 engaged listener. So it's as simple as that. If they have 1,000 listeners, you pay them $50 to $100 and they will shout out your podcast, promote your show to their audience. And it's done like an ad read. They just say it on the podcast as a mid-roll or a post-roll. So halfway through the episode, they go, hey, if you enjoyed this episode, we know you're going to absolutely love Managing Anxiety, a podcast helping entrepreneurs manage anxiety and scale their businesses. That's just a random example. That's a terrible pitch. It'll be much better than that. But the whole point is, again, you're being exposed to another person's audience by you sponsoring their show and your show being shouted out on that podcast. Now, why this is super valuable is because unlike, you being a guest on someone else's show, there's a cap to how many shows you can guest on per month because you only have a limited number of time and probably slots available to actually record podcasts. But when it comes to you sponsoring other people's shows, well, that's infinitely scalable. You could find 1,000 podcasts getting 1,000 listeners or 5,000 listeners per episode, and depending on your budget, of course, you can sponsor those shows. So of course for this one you need a budget set aside, but it's absolutely worth it, and we've experimented with this ourselves and it absolutely works. So this one, when it comes to sponsoring other shows, is much more scalable, requires a bit more money, but it's absolutely still worth doing and exploring if you have the budget for it. But here's the thing, why is sponsoring other shows so powerful? Well, listeners trust the host recommendation. They already listen to the podcast in podcast consuming mode. You're reaching people who actually want to listen to more podcasts, and it's scalable without the time investment. Like I mentioned, we've done this ourselves, sponsoring other people's shows, and it's worked phenomenally well. So this is us setting up, I think we paid $250, or rather it was around $250, something like that, to sponsor, I think 4 shows, which works. And for us, to help us tap into a new audience. So it was worth the investment, absolutely. Strategy number 3. This is strategic pod swaps. Now, what this is you essentially reach out to another podcast and you do a pod swap where you recommend their podcast to your audience and they recommend your podcast to their audience. It's a nice way where you can both collaborate. There doesn't need to be any transaction in terms of money. The main thing that you would have to do is find the right shows that would be a fit for you. So making sure that whatever podcast you shout out is one you actually trust, believe your audience will add value to, and think they add a different angle to your show. So again, if they're a competitor, it might not make sense. So you have to find a specific angle that works. The example I gave earlier is if I have an anxiety podcast, I can target a show that is about stress management because they're focused on stress management, not anxiety. I can target a show that's all about personal development because I know that some of their audience are likely potentially going through anxiety. I could target a show about general well-being, right? So these are all the shows that I can collaborate. And when I pitch this collaboration to this show to do this pod swap, they're incentivized as well to recommend my show to their audience. And they're not concerned about recommending our podcast to their audience because there's a clear link in terms of the value we can provide on their show. So let's say, for example, I'm the person and I've got a personal development podcast, and someone reaches out to me to say, hey, I'm going to shout your podcast out on my podcast because I think my audience would gain a lot of value from you. One, I'm happy, it's great, I get more exposure. But two, I don't feel like there's a conflict of interest because I'm on about personal development and they're specifically about anxiety. So I'll be happy to share their show on my podcast to my audience because I know it's adding additional value. So if you're worried about when people think that's funny, will it be, no. You just have to find the right angle and make the right proposal to a podcast. And if they see it, it'll be clear as day whether or not they should go for it or not. And that is what we call pod swap. Again, works super well and it's a fantastic way for you to leverage someone else's audience and for you to also add value to them. So here's how this magnifies your growth. Number one, you double your exposure with zero cost. Number two, you have built-in social proof. Number three, you're now building a long-term relationship with the host you're going to be doing pod swaps with. And finally, organic audience sharing, right? So you, again, leveraging, tapping into a new audience, doing this. And then the fourth and final strategy, newsletter leverage. Now, this final strategy might be the most underutilized one of all. And you might have heard of, guessing on other people's shows. You've probably heard of that before. You've probably seen other people doing it. You might have even thought about it. When it comes to sponsoring other podcasts, typically most people aren't doing that. Most podcasts who struggle to grow, who are looking to build their audience, build their personal brand, and attract dream clients to the business, they're kind of ignoring that. And with pod swaps, same thing with it as well. And the final strategy, leveraging newsletters, where essentially you're again sponsoring someone else's newsletter. The same way you sponsor someone else's podcast, you can sponsor someone else's newsletter. Smart podcasts are tapping into direct email audiences. Okay? Now, why this works so well is because you're accessing engaged readers. And when it comes to those engaged readers, when it comes to email marketing, the conversion rates are so much higher. If you have 10,000 followers and just promote a product to your following on social media, compared to 10,000 newsletter subscribers who actively read your newsletters, the newsletter is so much more valuable because people's attentions are undivided. They're reading your newsletter. Whereas with social media, you're relying on the algorithm to do the pushing for you. You're relying that only a fraction of your audience sees it. And when they do see it, they're not using their best brain to consume the content because they're on TikTok, they're on social media, there's a bunch of different distractions, there's 1,000 different notifications going up. So the attention is undivided. You don't get that when you're sponsoring and talking to an audience when it comes to newsletters. So like I mentioned, you have focused attention and of course there's a built-in trust factor. So if I find a show that makes sense and they have a newsletter, I'll sponsor their newsletter over trying to just get them to shout me out on social media. Now, here's where things get interesting, okay? When you combine these growth strategies are broken down, you create what I call the growth multiplication effect, where essentially you can guest on a podcast and then you can convert that into a pod swap. So you pitch to be a guest on a podcast and you mention to them, hey, I love this experience. I'd love to know if you'd be open for us to collaborate further. I would love to share your podcast with my audience because I think there's tons of value that you can give to my listeners. But I'd love to know if you're open to sharing my podcast and shouting us out in return for your show. Let me know if it makes sense or if it doesn't. That's sales Anthony coming out there, right? And then the second part, on the third part, is of course, if they have a newsletter, you can also offer to sponsor their newsletter. Now, the great thing is, most people aren't going to say to you, you know what, and I didn't want your money. You know what? We just had an amazing conversation. You've provided me a bunch of stories, a bunch of insights. You're clearly knowledgeable. But you know what? I'm not going to recommend you to my audience, and I'm not going to take your money because why would I want your money? That's not going to happen. People are going to be super keen because they're finally getting an opportunity to monetize their audience. And again, what's everyone trying to do? Monetize their audience. What are you trying to do? Monetize your audience. And if it makes sense and is the right fit, if someone pitched you money where they want to sponsor your podcast or sponsor your newsletter, and it made sense, and there wasn't a conflict of interest, and they were going to give you money, what are the chances you say no? Right? It is very unlikely. And from that, the fourth thing is ongoing partnerships, whether that's future workshops, whether that's future speaking gigs. It doesn't really matter. Building these long-term relationships allows you to build out your network whilst growing your personal brand, building your authority, and attracting new listeners and clients into your business. So look, like I mentioned, my name is Anthony Maneri. You've been absolutely fantastic. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've gave you 4 very simple and effective ways to grow your podcast without relying on social media, without spending countless hours creating any more content. Leverage other people's audience. Shortcut your way to a much bigger crowd who've never heard of you before. Do this on a consistent basis, and I promise you, I guarantee the results you get from this will be beautiful and you won't regret it. Now look, we help clients with this day in, day out in the Get More Listeners Academy, which is our one-on-one growth and monetization program. We're helping entrepreneurs and experts who want to grow a podcast that builds their personal brand and attracts dream clients to their business. This YouTube channel is created to help you gain clarity around why your podcast isn't growing as fast as you'd like, and providing you practical steps you can start taking today for faster growth. So if you want more source and you like this, I know you love all of our feature content, go through our back catalog, binge the entire thing. I promise you, it's highly targeted and it's highly relevant to where you're at right now. So be sure to like and subscribe, and of course you want to explore potentially working with us, there'll be a link down in the description. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.